Hey, Fellowship Kids team, Autumn here. Let's talk about what we're teaching to our kids this coming Sunday, February 18th. This month, the theme given to us by the curriculum writers is called Wow. It's all about God's power, and each story talks about Jesus' power and how he demonstrated that power through miracles that he performed. And each of these stories is supposed to lead us to not only the fact that Jesus demonstrated power, but that Jesus demonstrated the fact that he is God. And that is the source of his power. These stories, the miracles of Jesus, are really fun to teach to our kids because we can engage them in a number of ways. We can use sensory imagination, and we have some great tools on hand that can help us tell these stories. The Jesus Storybook Bible tells the story from our passage for our lesson this week, and the Biggest Storybook Bible, the Biggest Story Bible storybook also records this story for us. If you're on our South Broadway team, you can find this behind Sydney's desk, and you're free to snag it if you'd like to use it in class this Sunday. You also can tell the story in your own words or have the kids act it out. You might be tempted to think this week, our passage is from John 6, 1 through 15, that this is a familiar story. A bunch of people gathered to hear Jesus teach. He taught for hours. They began to get hungry, and the disciples were worried because the people were getting hungry. They wanted to send them away to find food to eat. But Jesus instead turned to the disciples and said, "You figure out how to feed them." And the disciples found some loaves and some fish, but it definitely wasn't enough. Jesus miraculously multiplied the food, fed everyone until they were satisfied, and there were even leftovers. But before you check out and think, I know that story, I can tell it on Sunday, I want to encourage you to go read the passage. Ask God to renew you before you head into class on Sunday morning. Let's talk about these miracles for a moment, though. Each of the miracles demonstrates Jesus' power, but also gives us a taste of his kingdom. In the gospel accounts, Jesus taught about the kingdom. He talked about the kingdom a lot and about what his kingdom, new covenant people were like. And then in each of these miracles, we get a taste of his kingdom. On February 4th, in our lesson, in our kids' classes, we met a centurion who had great political power and authority, but he also had a sick servant, and he didn't have any power to heal his servant. He lacked what he needed. He didn't have power to change that situation. On February 11th, the disciples were crossing the sea with Jesus in a boat, and a storm came up, and the stormy sea threatened to consume them. They were afraid. Even though many of the disciples were fishermen and were familiar with being out on the water, they were powerless in the face of the storm. And then this week, we meet a bunch of people gathered who are hungry and don't have food. They lack sustenance, and the disciples lack the resources and power to feed them. In each of these instances, Jesus demonstrates a specific type of power and authority, and he provides what is lacking. In our story on the 4th, Jesus healed the centurion's servant. He provided life and triumph over sickness and death. And in that story, we get a taste of Jesus' kingdom. He's showing us that in his kingdom, in God's kingdom, disease and death don't reign. The next week, February 11th, Jesus spoke to the wind and waves. He calmed the stormy sea. And in doing so, he's demonstrating to us something about his kingdom. In Jesus' kingdom, chaos, disorder, and fear don't reign. And this week, Jesus feeds the people. He provides what was lacking. He fed thousands of people until they were fully satisfied. And he demonstrates to us that in Jesus' kingdom, hunger and scarcity don't write the story. There is enough for everyone. So now let's look back at our specific passage for this week, John 6, and think about one other element of the story. In the conception of the Hebrew people who were gathered to listen to Jesus teach, the way they perceived the natural and supernatural, or physical and spiritual world, is different than the way that we, as post-Enlightenment thinkers, modern people, perceive it. So in our mind, for instance, here's an illustration from Scripture. We talk about body, mind, soul, spirit as sort of different parts of a person. But in the mind of an ancient Hebrew person, in fact, in the Old Testament, the word nephesh is used and it's translated soul. We often read it in the Old Testament scripture translated as soul. What it includes, though, in the mind of the biblical writers and in ancient Hebrew, is a whole living physical being. So when we read nephesh or soul, we're supposed to think of a whole integrated person. Now, why does that matter for this story? Well, let's talk about one other story before we get to this one. Jesus said, for instance, at the beginning of his ministry that he had come to bring sight to the blind. And then he healed a blind man by the pool of Bethsaida. And then he said, now you can see. So in that instance, Jesus gave the man sight, but he also pointed him towards a greater reality. So there was the physical sight, and now this man also possessed an understanding of Jesus and his kingdom that he had lacked before. So in our passage today, Jesus provides what the people lacked. He provides food and sustenance. But then in John 6:35, he tells them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. His provision of their physical need was to point them to the fact that he meets an even greater need. So as we think about our big idea this week, that Jesus has the power to provide, think about it in these terms. He has the power to provide all that we need.